Barron Trump, the youngest son of a dynasty that sparked more headlines than hurricanes, was about to step into the most outrageous, jaw-dropping spectacle of his young life. A moment so wild, so hilariously unhinged, that it would be whispered about as the greatest clash of chaos and conviction ever witnessed. It unfolded on a day meant for kindness, a day that promised to showcase his heart, when a Zelensky fan, fueled by a fire hotter than 1,000 suns, unleashed a storm of Trump hate so fierce it threatened to tear the world apart. What happened next was beyond astonishing, a twist so epic it left jaws on the floor and hearts pounding with curiosity. This is the tale that's got everyone hooked, dying to know how it all unraveled, and trust me, you won't see it coming. Barron Trump stood at the heart of a glittering spectacle, his lean, towering figure a beacon in the opulent expanse of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom. At 18, he'd carved a path beyond his family's shadow, his passion for animal welfare igniting this night. A fundraiser to launch a shelter for abandoned pets, a cause that pulsed through his veins. The room shimmered with extravagance. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables swathed in silk, their surfaces blooming with orchids and roses. The air buzzed with the clink of champagne flutes and the hum of anticipation, a symphony of wealth and goodwill swirling around him. The guest list was a constellation of stars, Hollywood icons, tech moguls, and political heirs mingled with animal rights advocates, their designer attire flashing in the soft glow. Cameras perched like hawks, their lenses trained on Barron as he moved through the crowd, his navy suit tailored to perfection, his blonde hair catching the light with every step. His presence was magnetic, a quiet strength radiating from his broad shoulders, his blue eyes sharp with purpose. Photographers jostled for the perfect shot, their flashes punctuating the air, while reporters murmured into recorders, weaving tales of the young Trump's latest venture. The ballroom's walls, lined with gilded mirrors, reflected a scene of orchestrated elegance. Waiters glided through the throng, trays laden with caviar and truffle-infused delights, their movements a dance of precision. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their notes weaving a tapestry of calm over the restless energy. Barron paused near a display of shelter animals, fluffy puppies and sleek cats in gilded cages, their eyes wide with curiosity, his hand brushing a kitten's fur as he smiled faintly, a rare crack in his composed exterior. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. The crowd watched, enchanted, their applause rippling as he took the stage, his height commanding silence without effort. At the podium, Barron's voice rolled out, deep and steady, painting a vision of a world where every stray found a home. He spoke of late nights planning, of visiting overcrowded shelters, his words laced with a sincerity that hushed the room. The audience leaned in, captivated by his earnestness, their faces a gallery of admiration and intrigue. Among them, however, one figure stood apart, a man in a worn leather jacket, his dark eyes glinting with something fiercer than curiosity. His name was Victor, a Zelensky fan whose devotion to Ukraine's leader burned like a wildfire, and tonight he carried a grudge heavier than the chandeliers above. Victor lingered near the back, his posture rigid, his hands buried in his pockets where a tiny Ukrainian flag lay folded, its blue and yellow stripes a secret ember of his intent. He tracked Barron's rise, seething at the Trump name, seeing in it a legacy of excess and indifference. This gala, with its glitz and goodwill, was to him a mockery, a stage for Barron to play saint while the world ignored greater struggles. His pulse quickened as Barron's speech built, each word stoking his resolve. He'd come to disrupt, to shatter the illusion, to scream truths no one here wanted to hear. The atmosphere thickened, a blend of reverence and tension coiling beneath the surface. Barron's mother, Melania, sat at a table near the stage, her elegant frame draped in ivory silk, her gaze flickering between pride and vigilance. She knew the spotlight's double edge, the way it could lift or lacerate, and tonight it felt sharper than ever. The quartet's music swelled, a counterpoint to the growing murmur as Barron thanked the donors, his hands gesturing broadly, his vision unfolding like a promise. Cameras zoomed in, capturing his every move, oblivious to the storm brewing in Victor's chest. As Barron neared the end of his address, the room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that crashed against the walls. He stepped back, basking in the moment, his chest rising with a breath of triumph. Victor saw his opening, a crack in the night's perfection, and his hand tightened around the flag. The crowd's roar masked his first step forward, his boots scuffing the polished floor as he edged closer, his eyes locked on Barron. Security lingered at the edges, their earpieces buzzing with routine checks, unaware of the fuse about to ignite. The gala stood on the brink, its glamour a fragile shell around the chaos to come. Barron Trump, the night's shining star, and Victor, the Zelensky fan with venom in his veins, were poised for a collision that would ripple far beyond these gilded walls. The air crackled with possibility, every heartbeat a countdown to the moment that would redefine them both and leave the world gasping in its wake. The chandeliers cast their golden light across the room, but the glow felt dimmer now, as if Victor's fury had siphoned some of the night's luster. The string quartet played on, their notes weaving a fragile thread of normalcy, but the guests' faces betrayed the strain, eyes darting, mouths whispering behind jeweled hands. Barron stood at the podium, his tall frame a pillar amid the unease, his expression a careful mask of composure. The Ukrainian flag lay crumpled near his feet, a silent witness to the storm that had just passed. He adjusted his tie, a flicker of steel in his blue eyes, and leaned into the microphone once more. "We're here for a purpose," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs with quiet authority. "Not for division, not for blame, but to build something better. Let's keep our focus where it belongs." His words were measured, a deliberate pullback from the brink, and the crowd responded with a swell of applause, tentative at first, then bolder, as if grasping for the comfort of the gala's original promise. Hands clapped, heads nodded, and the room seemed to exhale, eager to reclaim its polished veneer. But the fracture remained. At the edges of the ballroom, clusters of guests huddled, their voices low and urgent. Some cast sidelong glances at Barron, their admiration now tinged with curiosity. How would the youngest Trump handle this scar on his night? Others muttered about Victor, their tones split between indignation and unease. "Who let him in?" A woman in emerald satin hissed, her champagne flute trembling. "He's got a point, though," a man in a gray suit countered, his voice barely audible, eyes flicking to see who might overhear. Melania rose fully now, her movements fluid as she crossed to Barron's side, her presence a quiet anchor. She rested a hand on his arm, her gaze sweeping the room with the cool precision of someone who'd weathered far worse storms. "You did well," she murmured, her voice a soft thread beneath the crowd's hum. Barron nodded, his lips pressing into a faint line, but his eyes lingered on the doors where Victor had vanished. Something stirred behind his calm, a question, a spark, that he couldn't yet name. The event pressed forward, determined to outrun the shadow. A handler ushered a trio of sheltered dogs onto the stage, sleek greyhounds with soulful eyes, and Barron knelt beside them, his hand gentle on their coats as he spoke of their stories. The crowd softened, cooing at the animals, their focus shifting back to the cause. Donations poured in, announced in crisp bursts over the speakers. 10,000 from the Vanderbilts, 15 from Mr. Chen. The numbers climbed, a testament to the night's resilience, but the air still crackled with what had been said, what couldn't be unsaid. Beyond the ballroom's walls, the city churned, its pulse quickening as whispers of the confrontation leaked out. A reporter near the entrance tapped furiously at her phone, her tweet already taking shape. "Protester disrupts Trump Gala, Ukraine flag thrown at Barron. Chaos or courage?" The words would spread like wildfire, fanning the embers Victor had left behind. Inside, the gala clung to its script, laughter forced, smiles tight, but the glamour was a cracked facade and everyone felt it. Barron moved through the crowd, shaking hands, posing for photos with the adoptable pets, his charm unshaken on the surface. Yet as he paused to sip water, his gaze drifted again to the doors, then to the flag still lying near the stage, untouched by the staff as if it were a live wire. Victor's final shout replayed in his mind, The world sees you for what you are. And for the first time that night, a shadow crossed his face, brief but real. He set the glass down, his jaw tightening, and turned back to the guests, his smile snapping back into place like armor. The night wore on, the quartet's music swelling to fill the silences, but the unresolved tension hung heavy, a thread pulled loose from the gala's tapestry. Victor was gone, dragged into the night by security, but his presence lingered, a challenge unanswered, a wound unhealed. The event would end, the guests would leave, the donations would be tallied, but this moment would follow Barron, a ripple widening beyond the plaza's gilded cage. The story wasn't finished, it was only beginning. Press conference had ended, but the echoes of Barron Trump's words lingered in the air, a fragile shield against the storm he knew was brewing. He stepped out of the press room, the flurry of unanswered questions fatting behind him as he slipped into the quiet hallway. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he pulled it out, his breath catching as he read the message from an unknown number, "See you at the shelter." The words were simple, but their weight pressed against his chest like a stone. Victor. It had to be him. Barron's jaw tightened, his fingers hovering over the screen before he shoved the phone back into his pocket. The shelter's grand opening was in 2 days, and now it loomed not just as a milestone, but as a battlefield. Meanwhile, across the city in a dimly lit Brooklyn cafe, Victor hunched over his laptop, the live stream of Barron's press conference still frozen on the screen. The young Trump's smooth deflection, "I'm not a politician," played on a loop in his mind, each repetition stoking the fire in his gut. Barron hadn't answered the real question, hadn't faced the blood and pain tied to his family's name. To Victor, it was a dismissal, a coward's dodge wrapped in polished words. He slammed his coffee cup down, the bitter dregs sloshing onto the table, and opened a group chat with his allies. 2 days, he typed, his fingers stabbing the keys. "Shelter opening. We hit them there. Full rally. Bring everyone." Responses flooded in almost instantly on it. "Signs ready. This is our shot." Each one a spark feeding his resolve. Victor leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he pictured it. The shelter's pristine facade, Barron's smug face, the crowd's roar drowning out his platitudes. This wouldn't be another gala outburst. This would be a reckoning. The next 48 hours blurred past, a whirlwind of preparation on both sides. For Barron, it was a frantic push to ensure the shelter was ready. Cages cleaned, animals groomed, volunteers briefed. He threw himself into the work, his tall frame moving through the space with a quiet intensity, checking every detail. The shelter was his project, his chance to carve out something good, something his own. But Victor's text gnawed at him, a shadow he couldn't shake. Melania called once, her voice calm but firm. "You've made your statement. Now show them who you are." He clung to that, determined to keep the focus on the animals, not the chaos threatening to crash through the gates. For Victor, those hours were a fevered orchestration of logistics, flyers printed, routes planned, contacts rallied. He barely slept, his apartment a war room of maps and scribbled notes. His allies fanned out across the city, spreading word through back channels and social media, their message sharp and unrelenting. The Trumps can't hide behind charity. By the morning of the opening, a network of dozens, maybe hundreds, stood ready, their anger a live wire waiting to spark. The day arrived, crisp and bright, the late autumn sun casting long shadows over the shelter's modest lot in Queens. A small crowd had already gathered by mid-morning, local families, animal lovers, a handful of press, milling around the chain-link fence adorned with balloons and a banner that read, "A new home for all." Barron arrived early, stepping out of the SUV in a navy sweater and jeans, his casual attire a deliberate contrast to the gala's formality. He greeted volunteers with a tight smile, his eyes scanning the horizon for the trouble he knew was coming. Inside, the shelter buzzed with quiet excitement. Dogs barked from their kennels, cats stretched lazily in sunlit corners, and kids darted around, handing out adoption flyers. Barron crouched beside a scruffy terrier, scratching its ears as a photographer snapped a shot. For a moment, he let himself believe this could work, that the day could stay pure, untouched by the storm. But then he heard it, a low rumble like distant thunder growing louder with each passing second. He stood, his pulse quickening, and stepped outside. Beyond the fence, the street was filling, dozens of figures approaching, their chants coalescing into a single, piercing refrain. No more lies, no more Trumps. Signs bobbed above their heads, justice for Ukraine. Charity won't wash the blood, their edges sharp against the blue sky. At the front, leading the charge, was Victor, his face set in grim determination, a megaphone in hand. Barron's security detail stiffened, their hands hovering near earpieces as they murmured into radios. The small crowd of supporters shifted uneasily, some clutching their kids closer, others pulling out phones to record. Barron stood rooted by the gate, his breath shallow, watching as the protesters closed in. Victor's eyes found his through the crowd, a silent challenge reignited. "Barron Trump," Victor's voice boomed through the megaphone, cutting through the air like a blade. "You think dogs and cats can erase what your family's done? The world's watching, you can't hide anymore." The crowd roared, their chants swelling, fists pumping. A few surged against the fence, rattling the metal, their faces flushed with fury. Barron's hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing. He'd prepared for this, knew it was coming, but the raw force of it hit harder than he'd expected. Cameras swiveled toward him, reporters shouting questions over the din. "Barron, will you respond? What about Ukraine?" He felt the weight of every eye, every lens pinning him in place. A volunteer tugged at his sleeve, her voice shaky. "Should we call the police?" Barron shook his head, his gaze locked on Victor. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "Let them talk." He took a step forward, closer to the fence, the chants pounding against him like waves. This was his ground, his moment. He wouldn't run. Victor raised the megaphone again, his words sharp and personal. "Your shelter's a sham, Barron, a pretty mask for a rotten legacy. Tell us, where's the money really going? Who's it really helping?" The accusation hung in the air, a dare wrapped in venom. The crowd pressed closer, some hurling insults, others filming, their phones a constellation of tiny lights. Barron's jaw tightened, his calm cracking as anger flared beneath it. He wanted to shout back, to defend the shelter, the animals, himself. But he knew that's what Victor wanted, a reaction, a soundbite, a crack to widen. Instead, he turned to the nearest reporter, his voice steady despite the storm. "This shelter, about giving second chances to animals, to people. That's what I'm here for. If they've got proof it's anything else, let's see it." The words were measured, a gauntlet thrown back, and they shifted the air. Some protesters faltered, their chants stuttering as Barron's challenge rippled through. Victor's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the megaphone, but before he could fire back, a new sound cut through, a sharp bark, followed by a chorus of yips and howls from inside the shelter. The dogs had joined in, their voices piercing the tension, and for a fleeting second the absurdity of it broke the spell. A few in the crowd laughed, the mood teetering on the edge of chaos and comedy. Barron seized the moment, turning to the gate and unlatching it. "You want to see what this place is?" he called, his voice carrying over the noise. "Come in, look for yourselves." It was a gamble, bold and reckless, and his security team bristled, but he waved them off. The invitation hung there, daring Victor and his followers to cross the line. Victor hesitated, his megaphone lowering slightly, caught off guard by the move. The crowd murmured, some stepping forward, others holding back. A young woman with a sign, "Truth Matters," pushed past Victor, her curiosity outweighing her anger. "Fine," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Let's see it." A trickle of protesters followed, filing through the gate, their defiance softening into something closer to scrutiny. Inside, Barron led them past the kennels, his voice steady as he pointed out the animals, the volunteers, the stacks of donated food. "This isn't about my family," he said, meeting their eyes. "It's about them." He gestured to a litter of puppies tumbling over each other, their yips filling the air. Some protesters softened, crouching to pet the dogs, while others hung back, arms crossed, unconvinced. Victor stood near the entrance, his face a mask of frustration. Barron's pivot had stolen his momentum, turning his protest into a tour. He raised the megaphone again, but his voice faltered, drowned by the barking and the chatter of kids showing off their favorite cats. The moment was slipping, and he knew it. Barron caught his eye across the yard, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now Barron had held the line. The cameras kept rolling, the story unfolding in real time, and the world watched as the shelter, battered but standing, became more than a symbol. It became a choice. The day wore on, the crowd thinning as the sun dipped low. Victor and his core group retreated, plotting their next move, while Barron stayed until the last visitor left, his sweater dusted with fur, his resolve hardened. He'd face the fire and come through not unscathed but stronger. And as he locked the shelter's gate, he knew the fight was far from done. Victor wouldn't stop, and neither would he. The stage was set for the next round, and this time Barron vowed he'd be ready. The golden retriever pup nudged Barron's hand, its wet nose leaving a damp streak across his knuckles, and for a moment the clamor of the open house faded, the band's upbeat strumming, the kids' shrieks of delight, the hum of volunteers directing foot traffic. Barron stood, brushing the dust from his jeans, his gaze lingering on the retreating figures of Victor and his core group as they melted into the Queen streets. The protesters' chants had dulled to a distant murmur, but their departure felt less like a victory and more like a breath held before the next storm. He knew Victor, knew the fire in his eyes, the relentless edge to his resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. Barron, a voice called, snapping him back to the present. It was Maria, one of the shelter's lead volunteers, her clipboard clutched like a shield. She was a wiry woman in her 40s, with a no-nonsense braid and a knack for keeping chaos in check. We've got a line forming at the adoption tent. Folks want to meet you. You good? He nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, I'm good. Let's keep this moving. He followed her through the bustling yard, weaving past families snapping photos with the animals and a group of teens tossing a frisbee with a lanky mutt named Rocket. The open house was alive, pulsing with the energy he'd hoped for when he dreamed up this day. But beneath it, a current of unease tugged at him. Victor's parting words, "We'll find another way," looping in his mind like a warning siren. At the adoption tent, a small crowd had gathered, their faces bright with curiosity and something warmer, hope maybe. A young couple cradled a scruffy terrier mix, while an older man with a weathered cap knelt beside a graying shepherd, murmuring softly to it. Barron stepped forward, shaking hands, answering questions about the animals' stories, where they'd come from, how long they'd waited for homes. His voice steadied as he spoke, the rhythm of it grounding him. This was why he'd built the shelter, why he'd pushed through the permits and the protests. These moments, when a dog's wary eyes softened under a stranger's touch. "You're doing a fine thing here," the older man said, rising with a creak of his knees. "Don't let those loudmouths out there tell you different." He tipped his cap, and Barron felt a flicker of gratitude, a rare crack of light in the day's tension. "Thanks," he replied, his throat tight. "Means a lot." He turned to the next family, a mother and her daughter cooing over a litter of tabby kittens, and lost himself in the work, matching pets to people, scribbling notes for follow-ups, dodging the occasional tail swipe. For a stretch, it felt almost normal, the weight of the morning standoff lifting as the sun arced higher. But normal didn't last. A shout cut through the chatter, sharp and urgent from the far end of the yard. Barron's head snapped up, his pulse kicking as he scanned the crowd. Maria was already moving, her clipboard abandoned on a table, and he followed, pushing through the throng toward the source. Near the back gate, a cluster of volunteers hovered, their voices overlapping in a frantic hum. As he drew closer, he saw it. A jagged hole in the chain-link fence, freshly cut, the edges glinting in the sunlight. Beyond it, paw prints trailed into the alley, small, uneven, unmistakably canine. "One of the pups is gone," a volunteer stammered, a lanky kid named Jake with wide, panicked eyes. "The beagle mix Peanut. She was here 10 minutes ago, I swear, but then I turned around and—" Barron's stomach dropped. He scanned the alley, the prints fading into the shadows of the buildings beyond. "Anyone see who did this?" he asked, his voice low, though he already suspected the answer. Jake shook his head. No, but those guys were out there earlier, the ones with the signs. Victor, the name burned in Barron's throat unspoken. He clenched his fists, the pieces snapping into place. Retreat hadn't been surrender, it had been a feint. Sabotage, subtle but pointed, designed to hit where it hurt most. Losing an animal under his watch wasn't just a blow to the shelter. It was fuel for the narrative Victor wanted to spin. Negligence, incompetence, a Trump failing yet again. "We need to find her," Barron said, turning to Maria. "Get a group together, volunteers, anyone who can help. I'll take the alley. Call the cops too, but don't wait for them." His tone was clipped, all business, but inside a cold fury churned. He wouldn't let this stand. Maria nodded, barking orders as the volunteers scattered to regroup. Barron grabbed a leash from a nearby table and ducked through the hole, the metal edges snagging at his jacket. The alley was narrow, littered with trash and broken glass, the air thick with the smell of exhaust. He followed the prints, faint now on the concrete, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. "Peanut," he called, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "Come on, girl, where are you?" A rustle ahead stopped him cold. He rounded a dumpster and there she was, the beagle mix, her ears flopping as she nosed at a pile of cardboard, her tail wagging faintly. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. A figure stepped from the shadows, a wiry guy in a hoodie, one of Victor's crew, his phone raised like he'd been filming. The guy froze, caught, then bolted down the alley, his sneakers slapping the pavement. Barron didn't hesitate. He scooped Peanut into his arms, her small body trembling, and sprinted after the guy, adrenaline surging. The alley twisted, spilling onto a side street, and he spotted the figure ducking into a crowd near a bodega. He slowed, chest heaving, knowing he'd lost him for now. Peanut whimpered, licking his chin, and he tightened his grip, his mind racing. Back at the shelter, the search party had fanned out, but Barron waved them off as he emerged with Peanut in tow. The crowd parted, murmurs rippling concern, then relief as he handed her to Jake. "She's okay," he said, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Just spooked. We're good." Maria sidled up, her eyes sharp. "This wasn't an accident," she muttered. "That cut in the fence, someone planned it." "I know," Barron replied, his jaw tight. "And I saw one of them, filming, probably to twist it online." He glanced at the adoption tent, the family still milling about, oblivious to the near disaster. "We keep this quiet for now, focus on the day, they don't get to ruin it." She nodded, but her frown deepened. "They'll try again, Barron, you know that." "Yeah," he said, his voice hard, "and I'll be ready." The open house rolled on, the band picking up where it left off, the kids swarming Peanut with pets and coups. Barron moved through it all, shaking hands, smiling for photos, but his mind was elsewhere, on the figure in the hoodie, on Victor's next move, on the fragile line he walked between proving himself and protecting what he'd built. The shelter had survived the day, its spirit intact, but the fight was far from over. As the sun dipped low, casting the yard in amber, Barron stood alone by the fence, staring at the jagged hole. Patch it tonight, reinforce the gates, double the watch. Victor wanted a war, subtle or loud, and Barron wouldn't back down. Not for the animals, not for the people who believed in him, not for himself. The stakes were higher now, the game sharper, and he'd play it to the end, whatever that meant. The handshake between Barron Trump and Victor still echoed in the air, as the crowd's cheers faded into a hum of disbelief and cautious hope. The cameras lingered, their lenses trained on the two young men standing at the center of the shelter's packed yard. Enemies turned tentative allies in a single, seismic moment. The media frenzy that had threatened to bury the shelter under false rumors now pivoted, headlines shifting from scandal to spectacle. Trump heir and rival unite for global cause. But as the dust settled, Barron knew this was no tidy ending. The truce was fragile, a tightrope stretched over a chasm of distrust, and the real work was just beginning. The next morning, the shelter buzzed with a different energy. Volunteers clustered around the kennels, their voices a mix of excitement and unease as they processed the debate's aftermath. Maria, the volunteer coordinator, stood by the coffee pot, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed. A Ukrainian rescue partnership, she said, glancing at Barron as he poured himself a cup. "It's noble, but it's a hell of a leap. We're barely keeping up here." Barron nodded, the weight of the decision settling deeper into his bones. "I know, but if we pull it off, it's not just about saving face, it's about saving more lives. Victor's got connections over there. We've got resources. It could work." He took a sip, the bitter brew steadying him. "Besides, I'd rather have him inside the tent than tearing it down from the outside." Maria's lips twitched into a reluctant smile. "You're betting big on a guy who tried to ruin us yesterday." "Sometimes the biggest risks come with the biggest payoffs," Barron replied, his voice quiet but firm. He'd learned that much from his family, even if he was carving his own path. Across the yard, Victor arrived, flanked by two of his crew, Olna, a sharp-eyed woman with a tablet tucked under her arm, and Dmitri, a burly guy who looked more suited to breaking things than building them. Victor's expression was guarded, his usual fire banked but not extinguished. "Morning," he said, his tone clipped. "Let's get to it." Barron led them to a folding table set up near the adoption pens, where Peanut, the scruffy muddied rescued from Victor's earlier sabotage, napped in a patch of sun. The dog cracked one eye open, then went back to sleep, oblivious to the stakes of the meeting. Barron spread out a map of the shelter's current operations, alongside a laptop open to a spreadsheet of their budget and donor list. "Here, where we're at," Barron began, pointing to the figures. "We've got capacity for about 50 animals here, plus a network of fosters. Funds are tight, but we've got steady donors. What's your Ukrainian group bringing to the table?" Victor leaned in, his fingers tracing a line on the map. "Kyiv Animal Aid. They're pulling dogs and cats out of war zones, abandoned pets, strays, you name it. They've got boots on the ground, but no money, no transport. We get them here, you rehab them, find them homes. Split the costs, split the credit." Olna tapped her tablet, pulling up grainy photos, a skeletal dog nosing through rubble, a kitten cradled in a soldier's hands. "They've saved hundreds," she said, her accent thick. "But the need's endless. Shelters there are bombed out or overrun." Barron studied the images, his jaw tightening. He'd seen war on screens, heard it debated at dinner tables, but this was raw, real. "How many can we take?" he asked, looking at Maria. She hesitated, running numbers in her head. 10, maybe 15 to start. We'd need crates, vet checks, quarantine space, and that's assuming we can stretch the budget." "We'll find the money," Barron said, his mind already racing to donors he could tap, old family friends, maybe even a crowdfunding push. "But we need a plan. Victor, can your people handle transport?" Victor nodded. "We've got a guy who runs cargo flights, small planes, off-the-book stuff. He owes me a favor, first trips on me." Dmitri smirked. "Long as the dogs don't mind a bumpy ride." The group hashed out details for an hour. Logistics, timelines, a press release to announce the partnership. There were friction points. Victor pushed for more animals than Maria thought they could handle, and Barron had to mediate when Dimitri's bluntness grated on her nerves. But by the end, they had a rough framework. A pilot program to bring 10 Ukrainian rescues to the shelter within 2 weeks, with Victor's team coordinating overseas and Barron's handling the stateside effort. As the meeting broke, Victor lingered, his eyes on Peanut, who'd wandered over to sniff his boots. "You really think this changes anything?" he asked, his voice low. "Between us?" Barron met his gaze, unflinching. "It changes what we're fighting for. That's enough for now." Victor crouched, scratching Peanut's ears, a ghost of a smile flickering across his face. "We'll see," he said, then stood and walked off, his crew trailing behind. That afternoon, Barron stood at the shelter's fence, watching the volunteers prep extra kennels. The debate had been a crucible, forging something new from the ashes of their clash. He'd turned Victor's attack into an opportunity, but the road ahead was uncharted. Could they trust each other? Could they make this work without the old wounds reopening? His phone buzzed, a text from his mother, "Melania, proud of you. Stay strong." He smiled faintly, pocketing the phone. The shelter wasn't just his project anymore. It was a bridge, a test, a chance to prove he could rise above the noise of his name. Across town, Victor sat in a dimly lit room, staring at a photo of Kiev's shattered streets. He'd agreed to the partnership, but his motives weren't pure. It was a lifeline for the animals, yes, but also a foothold, a way to keep Barron in his sights, to test his limits. The truce held, but the game wasn't over. As the sun dipped below the horizon, both knew the same truth. This was only the beginning. The fundraiser had drawn to a close, but its impact lingered far beyond the shelter's gates. Barron Trump stood near the now-empty adoption pens, his hands clasped behind him, watching as volunteers stacked folding chairs and swept away the last remnants of the day's bustle. The sun dipped low, painting the yard in a warm amber glow, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. The event had been a resounding success. Dozens of animals had found homes, donations had flooded in, and the shelter's future looked brighter than ever. Yet, beneath the triumph, a quiet unease tugged at him, tied to the memory of the confrontation with Victor, the Zelensky fan whose disruption had nearly derailed it all. The media had latched onto the story with fervor. Headlines blazed across screens and newspapers. Barron Trump faces down protester, saves shelter fundraiser, and young Trump's composure wins hearts. His phone buzzed incessantly, praise from supporters, cautious nods from skeptics, even a clipped "well done" from his father. Overnight, the world began to see him not just as a Trump, but as a figure of his own making. Still, as he stood there, his thoughts circled back to Victor's parting shot. "You think this changes anything?" The question lingered, unresolved. Meanwhile, across the city in a cramped apartment overlooking the East River, Victor sat hunched over his laptop, the blue glow illuminating his furrowed brow. The news replayed the fundraiser, Barron's calm demeanor, the crowd's applause, the animals finding homes. Each clip twisted something inside him. He'd stormed the event to expose Barron, to puncture the polished image, but instead he'd been outmaneuvered, his anger met with kindness he hadn't anticipated. His allies were thrilled, already planning next steps for their Kiev animal aid partnership, but Victor felt adrift, caught between resentment and doubt. He slammed the laptop shut and paced the room, his boots scuffing the worn floor. The Ukrainian flag on the wall stared back at him, a silent anchor to his cause. But the shelter wasn't a lie, and Barron's actions hadn't been hollow. The anger that had fueled him now warred with a creeping regret. Grabbing his jacket, he headed out into the night, the city's pulse drawing him back to the shelter without a clear plan. The gates were locked when he arrived, the yard quiet save for a lone volunteer securing the premises. Barron's SUV still sat out front, a dark silhouette against the streetlights. Victor hesitated, his breath visible in the crisp air, then approached. The volunteer, a young woman with a tired smile, recognized him instantly. "We're closed," she said, then paused. "You're him." "Yeah," Victor rasped. "Is Barron still here?" She nodded, glancing back at the building. "Inside, finishing up. You want me to?" "I'll wait," he interrupted, leaning against the fence. She shrugged and slipped inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Moments later, the door creaked open and Barron emerged, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He spotted Victor and stopped, his face a mask of calm curiosity. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. "You're still here," Barron said at last, his voice even. Victor shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check in." Barron's brow lifted slightly. "Check in." The words Victor had rehearsed faltered. He'd come to confront, to demand answers, but now, face to face, they felt wrong. "The partnership," he said, steadying himself. "You really think it'll work?" Barron studied him, then nodded. "I do. We've got a chance to build something real, but it's not just about the animals, is it?" Victor bristled. "What's that mean?" Barron stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're still angry, still looking for a fight. I get it, your cause matters to you. But if we're doing this, you've got to decide. Are you in or out?" The words cut deep, a challenge Victor couldn't dodge. His fists clenched, the familiar fire flaring, but then he saw the exhaustion in Barron's eyes, the weight he carried too. "I'm in," he said, the admission rough. "But don't think I'm blind to who you are, what your name carries." Barron's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I don't expect you to be. Just don't let it stop you from seeing what we can do." They stood there, two young men on the cusp of something uncertain, the night pressing in. Victor gave a curt nod and turned to go, but Barron's voice halted him. "Victor!" He glanced back. "Thanks," Barron said, softer now, "for giving this a shot." Victor's throat tightened, but he didn't reply. He walked off, the gate clanging shut behind him, Barron's words echoing in his wake. A week later, the first flight touched down at a small airstrip outside the city, its hold brimming with crates of rescues from Ukraine. Barron and Victor stood shoulder to shoulder on the tarmac, the plane's lights glinting off their faces. The partnership had held, defying the odds, and as the first animal, a gaunt shepherd with a bandaged paw, stepped onto solid ground, a quiet shift passed between them. Not friendship, not yet, but a mutual respect forged in the crucible of their clash. The world took notice, their story spreading. Barron Trump and Zelensky fan unite for animal rescue, and from confrontation to collaboration. Barron, stepping out from his family's long shadow, and Victor, channeling his passion into a new fight. Together, they'd built something tangible, something that cut through the noise. As the final crate was unloaded, Barron turned to Victor. "We did it," he said, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Victor nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, but it's just the beginning." Barron smiled faintly. "Good." And with that, they walked back toward the shelter, side by side, the path ahead unwritten but theirs to carve. In a world fractured by division, they'd found a fragile thread of common ground, proof that even the deepest rifts could, with time, begin to mend. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.